Afternoon, Commissioners. This is not a formal meeting, so we will not have a roll call or any kind of special fanfare. But thank you for being here. We do have Shauna Woody Cousins, who is with BKD, here to give you some in-person training. You may recall that you all received an email a couple weeks ago about kind of the rules that we're under for the American Rescue Plan Act. And so because there are some questions about what exactly that means, and because this goes on for such a long time, we want to make sure that you had some in-person training this time as opposed to what we did with CARES. So Shauna is here to walk you through some basics. She'll have some cases at the end, some case studies to talk through, I think, to give you some really good insight on things you may really encounter. And then we will record this and make it available after the fact, but this is not being broadcast live or anything like that. So with that, Shauna, are you ready to kick us off?
I am.
Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, and thank you all for giving me some of your time today. If you do have questions as I go through, I'm happy to answer them, or if you want to wait and hold them till the end, I'm happy to do that as well. So the point of this presentation is not to definitively decide for you exactly every single conflict you might become aware of. It's more to give you an understanding of the background of conflicts of interest and how those of us who work in this space often look at it. My experience comes from my 35 years as a forensic accountant, so doing forensic investigations and fraud investigations. I have quite regularly actually been involved with looking at conflicts of interest, apparent conflicts of interest, potential conflicts of interest, corruption, what have you. So we'll go ahead and get started here. Now, because of the multiple roles that any individual plays in their daily life, they inherently possess many different interests and loyalties. At any given time, these interests may compete, as you might expect. And such conflicts are a part of life, and they are unavoidable. So it's not a situation where we can regulate conflicts of interest away completely. It just can't happen. Public officials, as stewards of the public trust, are required to put the public's interest before their own. Impropriety occurs when an office holder, faced with conflicting interests, puts his or her personal or financial interest above that of the public. A common conflict of interest in local governments happens when office holders face a vote on a real property or land use matter that affects their personal holdings. Other examples include voting to grant a benefit to a company in which the office holder owns stock, or even to a nonprofit organization on whose board the office holder may sit as a director. Conflicts of interest in the public sector are particularly important because if they're not recognized and controlled appropriately, they can undermine the fundamental integrity of the officials, the decisions that are made, agencies, and the governments themselves. Also, conflicts of interest interfere with the basic ethical principle of fairness and treating everyone the same. A public official should not take unfair advantage of his or her position by voting on a matter that could benefit them at the expense of others. So let's start out with kind of a general definition of what a conflict of interest is. Historically, defining the term conflict of interest has been subject of many varying opinions. As all public officials have legitimate interests which arise out of their capacity as private citizens, conflicts of interest, again, cannot simply be avoided or prohibited. They must thereafter be defined, identified, and therefore managed. In the public sector, a conflict of interest arises when a public official has private capacity interests which could improperly influence the performance of their official duties and responsibilities. It could be a situation that could cloud the official's judgment because of the possibility of a clash between the official's self-interest and the interest of the public. It could be a situation in which the official's responsibility to a third party limits the official's ability to discharge his or her responsibility to the public. So when I say private interests, what am I talking about? Private interests are not limited to merely financial or pecuniary interests. They are not just having to do with money. A conflict of interest may involve otherwise legitimate private capacities activities as well. Personal affiliations, associations, family interests, what have you, if those interests could reasonably be considered to likely improperly influence the official's performance of his or her duties. Many times, government officials honestly believe that they are not being unduly influenced by their personal stake in an issue. They may feel, to the contrary, that their interest in the matter gives them special insight into the matter at hand. A public official who ran on the platform of revitalizing the downtown area, for example, may feel entirely justified in supporting measures to improve that area, even if part of the benefits of such improvement might go to their own business in the downtown area. The public official might argue that he or she understands the problems of a downtown business because he or she owns one. The public official might claim that their constituents elected them specifically to represent that interest. However, it can be almost impossible for individuals to determine whether they are being fair and unbiased if their self-interest is somehow involved. Even the appearance of impropriety undermines the public's faith in the process and faith that it will be fair. So when we talk about conflicts of interest, there's a two-question test that in my field of forensics we often start with. Question number one, for what official functions or duties is official X responsible? Question number two, does official X have private interests of a relevant kind? If the answer to question two is yes, then our starting point is we believe that there's a possibility that the official has a conflict of interest. Now, relevant interest in this context refers to a private interest which could be affected by the performance of the official's duties or functional abilities, and it is both qualitative and quantitative. So from a qualitative perspective, it would be reasonable to believe that the private interest could improperly influence official X's performance of their official duties. For instance, there was family, parental responsibilities, very close association with a vendor, political association, etc., then that would be a qualitative issue. A quantitative issue would it be reasonable to believe that the private interest could improperly influence official X's performance of their official duties, basically based upon the value of the situation to the public official. So there we might be looking at a family business interest or an opportunity to make a large profit, or conversely, an opportunity to avoid a large loss. Now, there's also a thing that we refer to as an apparent conflict of interest. And an apparent conflict of interest can be said to exist where it appears that the public official's private interest could improperly influence the performance of their duties. But this is, in fact, not the case. Examples of appearances of conflicts would include doing business with a company that employs a family member, even if that family member is not involved in the business relationship. Just the fact that you have given a contract to a company with which you have a family member that is employed, to some could be seen as a potential or an apparent conflict. Another example would be eating a meal at an expensive restaurant with a vendor just ahead of the awarding of a large contract, even if the public official actually paid for their own meal. Again, what you're looking at here is that the perception of a conflict can be just as damaging as an actual conflict itself, because people in the general public will form their opinions based upon what they see, and they may not actually have all of the facts. So with an apparent conflict of interest, we've got that same two-pronged test, but in this particular case, rather than the answer to question 2 being yes, the answer to question 2 is it appears to be the case that official X may have relevant or private interest, and official X therefore has an apparent conflict of interest. And again, the apparent conflicts of interest can be seriously damaging to the public's confidence in a public official or to the official's agency, and it can be just as damaging as an actual conflict that might occur. An apparent conflict of interest should therefore be treated as though it were a conflict of interest. We should go through the same rigorous testing and consideration that we would for an actual conflict. And we do that until such time as doubt is removed and the matter is determined after investigation of all of the relevant facts to have not been a conflict. Now, the last part of, we talked about conflict of interest, an apparent conflict of interest, and the last thing I'll just touch on briefly is corruption. And this is where the private interest has, in fact, compromised the proper performance of a public official's duties. The specific situation is better regarded as an actual instance of misconduct or abuse of office, or even an instance of corruption, rather than as a conflict of interest. So when I talk about conflicts of interest, what are some of the kind of common types of conflicts that I've seen? Well, first of all, self-dealing is one that we see very, very commonly, and that's where The individual is directing the organization's business activity to a firm in which the individual has an interest. Second is outside employment. This can be where an individual has a second job or side business that absorbs work time or detracts from their productivity that they would otherwise apply to their job. Third is cronyism, and cronyism is actually one of the ones that I personally in my practice have seen most often. Cronyism is awarding business opportunity to family or friends. Now, public officials have friends, and sometimes those friends may want to do business with or with their organization, in this case, the county. Public officials need to disclose the friendship and recuse themselves from discussions of or voting on projects where a friend could potentially benefit. So the next question becomes, what is the definition of a friend? It's not clearly defined in any of the literature regarding conflicts of interest. So is a friendship defined by how many times you go to lunch or play golf with that associate? Or is a friendship defined by the substance of the relationship that you have with that individual? And this is something that you will get a lot of different opinions on. And so it is something that we are always very careful when we see this particular situation to make sure that we understand to the extent we can the actual depth of the relationship between the individuals. Is it really a professional relationship in which there is some social element, or is it truly a close personal friendship that could potentially impair someone's decision-making ability? A lot of local governments that I've been involved with, since this is hard to define, they have chosen to put limits around how much money can be spent over usually a calendar year from one particular vendor. So for instance, a common one that I see is no more than $150 from a vendor or any of its members in a calendar year, or in some cases it may be a single instance of no more than $50. I have seen the single instance be no more than $20. And from a personal standpoint, I certainly am not implying that anyone's integrity can be purchased for a $20 meal or even a game of golf. But we have to be concerned again about the appearance. And so again, some local governments have chosen to define exactly with dollar values what it can be accepted and what may be out of line. So another common type of conflict is nepotism, and this is arranging the hiring of a family member to a paid position. And then we have gifts. Gifts is another big area that I have run into in my forensics practice. And generally, a gift is accepting anything of significant value from a vendor. So again, then we have to deal with the issue of how do you define significant? What is significant to one person may not be significant to another. Therefore, a lot of local governments have chosen to come up with a dollar value and define the amount of a gift that must be reported or that can be received, and in what instances their public officials can receive those gifts. And then the last common type I wanted to touch on is referred to as misuse of position. This is using one's official position to get something that he or she is not entitled to, or to get something for someone else that they are not entitled to. So an example of this might be avoiding a speeding ticket by asking the police officer who stops you, "Do you know who I am?" and showing that police officer your ID to try to just get a warning rather than a ticket based upon your position. So let's go a little bit deeper into the area of gift. What is a gift? A gift may be a gift of entertainment, hospitality, travel, any form of benefit, again, of a significant value. It can be an item of property, consumable in nature. It can be food. It could be books, art, jewelry, a number of things. Some of the most common types of gifts that I've seen in my forensic practice is money in the form of a no-interest loan that never gets collected, vehicles that are sold to the public official at well under their Blue Book value. Fishing and hunting trips seem to be very, very popular. Super Bowl and World Series trips in Kansas City, as the last couple of years, again, were somewhat popular. And I've also seen a couple of situations where a construction company did free construction at the public official's home in order to help them get the contract with the government agency. So where an official receives more than one gift from the same person or entity in a financial year, or the current market value of all of these gifts exceeds a certain dollar threshold, again, there may be an assumption of impropriety. So I wanted to also give you all kind of a gifts and gratuities checklist. And you'll notice there's going to be 4 parts to this, and they all start with a letter that forms the word gift. So it's a little acronym to remember. So first of all, when you are looking at accepting a gift or gratuity, you need to consider, is this gift genuine? Is it really an appreciation for something that you have done as your role as a public official? Was it not requested or encouraged in any way? Second, independent. If you accept the gift, would a reasonable person have any doubt that you could continue to be independent in performing your job duties in the future, especially if the person responsible for the gift is involved or affected by a decision that might be made? The F stands for free. If I accept this gift, would I feel free of any obligations to do something in return for the person responsible for the gift or for his or her family, friends, or associates? And the T is transparent. Am I prepared to declare this gift and its source transparently to my organization and its constituents, to my professional colleagues, and to the media and the public generally? When I was in business school, they referred to this as the Wall Street Journal test. They recommended that you never do anything that you would not want to see on the front of the Wall Street Journal. So it's kind of the same little goal there. Couple of things, next couple of slides are factors for you all to consider when you are taking a look at whether or not there is a bias or whether or not you can actually continue to be impartial. The first would be the nature of the relationship between the official X and the interested party. Again, is it really more of a professional relationship? Does it appear to be more of a personal association? Secondly, whether official X has any direct financial interest in the interested party or property. The nature of the interest that the interested party has in the matter, so what's their ownership, how important is it to them, and why. Whether the decision will impact the relationship between the official and the interested party. Whether the interested party has taken an active position on the issue before official X, and if so, whether official X was involved in formulating that position on behalf of the interested party. So I always kind of personally think about this as a situation where you may have a vendor who is lobbying the public official to make a decision or stand up a program that would benefit them in a particular way. Now, that happens all the time. You know, that is what your constituents and the vendors in your locale, that's marketing to them. They're letting you know what the need is, what they have to offer, and they're hoping that they will be considered for future jobs. So it's not that this should never happen. It's just that you need to consider, was the lobbying on their part significant enough that others could claim that it swayed your decision and resulted in you deciding for that particular entity over another. Another issue to consider is whether there have been discussions outside of the public hearing between the interested party or his or her representatives and officials concerning the matter. So this is kind of the step down from the previous one. In the previous one, we pretty much got lobbying by the interested party. In this second one here, we've got the lobbying being done a little more informally. It may be done by friends and associates so that there's not any necessarily direct contact between the vendor and the public official. And then the last slide on the factors to review for bias or impartiality. Think about whether official X believes he or she can be impartial in deciding the issue and base the decision solely upon information from the public hearing, so not using any information that hasn't been presented in the public forum. Whether the public record completely discloses the relationship between official X and the interested party. And then lastly, whether official X has disclosed any factors that are relevant to the concept of fairness in performing his or her official duties. So the next 10 slides, I have 10 short case studies. I'm going to read through those case studies, and the last part of it on each slide is going to be a question. I have the answers to the question. So what I want to know from you all is, do you want to involve in answering the questions, or do you want me to just tell you what the answer to the question is based on the literature? How would you like to proceed? I don't want to make anybody uncomfortable. If you'd rather I just read the answer, that's fine. But if you would like to discuss it, that's fine as well. Okay. Well, I will jump in. And if anyone has anything for the good of the order, feel free. Okay, case study number 1. Official X is a manager of a department and has the final decision with regard to the hiring for vacant positions. One of the applicants is a friend of Official X. Official X is also related to the applicant's spouse. This is not known to the other members of the hiring committee. Official X decides that she will not allow this relationship to influence her judgment. Official X decides to tell the hiring committee that she will not participate in the interview process as the applicant is a friend. But as a manager of the department, Official X insists on making the final decision in accordance with the views of the committee. Is the decision that Official X has landed upon with regard to this situation appropriate? Commissioner Dennis is shaking his head no, and you would be right. So this should be seen as an apparent conflict of interest, which could actually compromise the credibility of the entire selection process for that open position because of the family relationship. And if you read the case study quickly, you will notice that although the official disclosed her friendship relationship, she did not disclose that there was a familial relationship, which is usually seen as a stronger relationship. Official X could compromise the integrity of the hiring committee members and the friend if the friend is hired. So the question that would need to be considered is, why would Official X not be prepared to tell the committee the whole story about that family relationship, or to alternatively withdraw from the hiring committee for this position? All right, case study number 2. Official X is responsible for the final decision in awarding the organization's building maintenance contracts. Official X awards the contract to a company that employs his daughter in a mid-level technical job. The procurement process leading to the decision was very minimal, allowing Official X considerable discretion in his choice of the contractor for the work. Official X did not mention the situation to anyone when he decided on the contract, as he did not believe it was a personal conflict of interest. Is this situation a serious apparent conflict of interest, or is it an actual conflict of interest? The answer is that it would be considered a serious apparent conflict of interest. Official X could be seen to be ensuring that his daughter's employer had continuing work. This appearance would be made more serious if the selection for the contract was not administratively transparent, fair, and rigorous. So if it hadn't been, let's say, competitively bid. In this case, it might be impossible for Official X to demonstrate that he did not have an actual conflict of interest. So if that's the case, what could have been put in place, or what should happen to make this scenario okay? If there had been a rigorous, independent, and transparent contract evaluation process by knowledgeable individuals, and Official X had been involved only in the final decision, as no more than the formal approval following the Contract Evaluation Committee's recommendation, then this would not necessarily be an apparent conflict of interest, because there would have been safeguards put in place to make sure that the decision was actually made by individuals who were not involved in the apparent conflict, and the public official was simply approving their recommendation. Okay, case study number 3. Official X is a senior official in the Corporate Services Division. A contractor who has serviced the organization's computer equipment for the past 2 years offered Official X a computer to use at home free of charge. Over time, this person has become a close friend of Official X. Official X does a lot of work at home and on the weekends, and the computer would be very useful for Official X's son in his current college studies. The son cannot afford to buy a computer on his own. The contractor says the computer is fairly old and so not worth very much. So Official X accepts the offer. The organization's computer equipment service contract is due to renew in 3 months' time, and Official X is normally a member of the committee which decides the winning bid. Should Official X accept the offer of the computer from her friend? No, Official X should not, because her role on the service contract bid committee would be a serious conflict of interest. All right, case study 4. Official X is a chief anti-corruption officer for his organization. His deputy has overall responsibility for the current major risk assessment of the organization's financial operations. A consultant from the company, which is advising on the risk assessment project, asks Official X if it would cause difficulties if the company were to invite the deputy to the Super Bowl. The consultant says that the company would provide the airfare and accommodations, and the deputy would also be a guest in the company's corporate hospitality suite. The deputy is a huge Chiefs fan and is a former Division I player that had a significant chance to go pro, but for injuries his senior year of college. Is there a conflict of interest involved in this offer? The answer is yes. The gift from the consultant risks being seen as an attempt to compromise the deputy's independent decision on the review. The gift may also be seen as intended to influence Official X's decision-making on further projects in which the consultant company may be interested. Case Study 5. Official X discovered that, for the last 2 years, a close friend at work has been stealing small amounts of cash and altering official financial records to disguise the thefts and taking office supplies from the organization. The friend has been selling the supplies at the market in the next town. Because of the organization's poor accounting system, no one suspected that anything is wrong. The friend has a sick husband and a young family to support, and her salary as a civil servant is too low for the family to live on comfortably. Is there a conflict of interest in this case? Yes. I see you're all shaking your heads yes. Official X has a conflict over whether to do his duty and report the thefts or to avoid the problem altogether and kind of have a much more quiet life than what's going to happen if he makes that report. The friend had a conflict of interest at one stage. She had a conflict between her duty, not to steal from her employer, and her private interest. And, note there that the case study does say that, she is in financial straits. She can't support her family on her low salary. So, this is one of those situations that does happen, and it may pull at your heartstrings, but it is still a conflict of interest and should be reported. Case 6. Official X is the complaints officer in the Department of Education. He is asked to investigate a complaint that the department's contracting processes are corrupt. The department contracts for the supply of a lot of printed materials every month. The 3 printing firms, which have always done all of the department's printing work in the past, are well respected for the quality and cost effectiveness of their work. On investigation, Official X discovers that a senior contract officer in the department has an uncle that just purchased a local printing business. The contract officer's job is to process all tenders for small to medium printing contracts. Official X learns that on several occasions, the senior contract officer has awarded the contract to her uncle's printing company, even though his price was the same as that of the other competing companies. In each case, she gave the reason that her uncle's company was more reliable and would do a better job. Is this a conflict of interest? This is an apparent conflict of interest because of the family connections, but it appears that the contract officer has decided each case arbitrarily based only on her opinion and excluded other companies from competing. On examination, it may turn out to be objectively true that her uncle's company is the best company for the contract, but we don't know that because that examination was never completed. Case Study 7. Organization, again, contracts for a lot of printing materials every month. 3 printing companies have always done the printing work, are very well respected, and cost effective in their work. The contract officer's father just purchased a local printing business, and the contract officer processes all tenders for small to medium printing contracts. The contract officer has access to the details of all of the other companies' tenders for printing contracts, and her father asks if she can tell him the information in their bids so that he can submit quotes at a lower rate. The organization just launched a major program to cut costs. The contract officer knows that the organization could save many thousands of dollars on printing costs over the year if she does as her father asks. Is this a conflict of interest if the organization will benefit through substantial savings? Yes, it's a conflict. The contract officer cannot legitimately decide that the savings justify the corrupt practices. And the contract officer would also gain personally through her family interest in this particular case. Case Study 8. Official X, an elected official, operates a business in a town in which one of his close friends is the husband of the chief of police. Official X claims to be owed quite a lot of money by another merchant in town. The merchant has been very sick and slow to pay his debt as a result. Official S asks his friend whether his wife can do anything to help Official X obtain the money he is owed. Later, the chief of police gives one of her sergeants an unofficial instruction to make life difficult for the merchant without giving any reason for the instruction. The merchant is not under any suspicion of wrongdoing and has no criminal record. The sergeant then telephones the merchant and suggests that he can expect a visit from the police every day until his debt is paid. Is there a conflict of interest in this case? Clearly, there is a conflict of interest here. It's a conflict between the public duty and the private interest of the police chief. On one hand, she is wanting to keep her husband and his friend happy, but on the other hand, she is giving an unlawful instruction, which is likely to undermine public confidence in the integrity of the police department. Second to last case study here. On occasions, and often on their own time, most senior officials of a government agency attend lunches or dinners with a wide range of business people, including representatives of schools, churches, the local newspaper and TV, property developers, consultants, manufacturers, and construction companies. This has been an understood part of the senior officials' activities, and there has never been any fee or other money involved in these events at all. The activity has never, therefore, been seen as a problem in the past. On one recent occasion, 3 of these officials attended what was reported in the newspaper the next day as a lavish lunch hosted by a prominent local construction company. This occurred a week before the organization decided finally on awarding a number of major construction contracts. It was reported that the company which hosted the lunch won the majority of the contracts. Are there integrity issues here? Okay. While some social contact between officials and representatives of the private sector is inevitable and may often be desirable, the provision of and timing of the reportedly lavish lunch is likely to raise suspicion in the minds of some people in the public. And that's even if there's nothing untoward that went on. Just the timing of the fact that this lunch that was described as lavish, and it may have been lavish or it may not have been lavish, that's also a judgment call there. But the timing of that with the contract being let is what really creates the issue here. The lunch also creates at a minimum an apparent conflict of interest for the officials. In this example, it's irrelevant that the lunch occurred during the officials' free time. They were there talking to the contractors. It could have been after work hours. It would still be seen by most as having been a function of their public duties. And the last case study, we have a middle-level manager employed by a public authority repeatedly refuses to recruit or select for training opportunities staff from particular religious and ethnic backgrounds, even when the individuals are well qualified and skilled, because, as she says, those people make me uncomfortable. Is there a serious conflict of interest here, or is this just a matter of personal preference? Conflict of interest. And actually, it's an abuse of office as well, in the form of self-dealing. The manager is indulging her personal prejudice against the ethnic group concerned at the expense of her employer's interest in obtaining trained staff and in having a reputation as a good employer who treats people fairly. Of course, the legitimate interest of the staff who are applying for these jobs are also excluded as training is being denied, and the community at large may also be seen as disadvantaged in that equal access to public employment opportunities for all qualified citizens is prevented by this particular manager's conduct. So those are just some brief examples of various types of conflicts that any public official in any government agency, local government agency, might run into, and kind of how, based on the literature, we would say that those would be decided. However, if we got into the nitty-gritty of any of these and you came up with specific examples of what if here, what if there, it could change the answer, because again, how you determine something is an actual conflict is by, transparently and in the open, discussing all of the minutiae about that particular relationship or issue, and then making a determination whether or not it was in fact a conflict of interest. So if you run into a potential conflict of interest, how should it be handled? First of all, it needs to be disclosed. Trust in the integrity of the official and the organization can be seriously damaged by suspicion that the public official's performance of official duties could be affected by a personal conflict of interest. All public officials have private interests of some kind in their capacity as private citizens, and it is necessary to identify and manage conflicting interests whenever they arise in order to maintain trust. Trust can be protected and improved by making sure that there is no improper connection between the official's official duty and their private interest, including the interest of related persons or organizations. The point of disclosure is transparency. Transparency, or being completely open and frank, becomes important when dealing with both actual and apparent conflicts of interest. As discussed earlier, the apparent conflicts of interest are based on perceptions, and those perceptions very often are not accurate. So by disclosing it and having transparent discussions about it, you can, in fact, sometimes impact the public's perception of the situation. So when it comes to conflicts of interest, appearance is as important as reality. This is why disclosing conflicts of interest is important. And the disclosure process is intended to help the workforce be transparent and accountable in their actions and decision. But disclosure of the potential conflict of interest does not make an actual conflict go away. So after you have disclosed a potential interest or conflict of interest, there may be some additional steps that need to be taken, and I've listed some of those on the slide here. It may be that you need to recuse yourself, or the public official needs to abstain from discussion about the issue. So not only should they abstain from voting, best practices would say they should not be involved in discussions or in debating about that in the public official's setting. They shouldn't make public pronouncements about the situation, and they should refrain from from private influence. In my practice, we go one step further, and we say that a best practice is to not only abstain from voting and from participating in discussion, it's also to not be in the room. Because I have been in situations before where someone has recused themselves because they had a potential conflict of interest, so they didn't participate in the discussion and they didn't vote, but they sat in the corner of the room and they sighed and they rolled their eyes and they made faces so that anyone in the room was clearly aware of what their opinion was. And as far as I'm concerned, that's a form of communication. So again, a best practice would be to actually not be present in the room when discussions or voting is being had. Just leave you with a couple of best practices here. It's a good idea to have a written policy on conflicts that is annually reviewed and updated. Be purposeful in creating a culture of candor so that people are comfortable and are open about sharing potential conflicts of interest. You don't want a culture of inquisition. Conflict of interest training, it should be provided to new employees or officials, and a refresher training provided for existing employees or officials periodically. A lot of local governments that I work with will do some sort of a refresher online training every 2 years. Have all employees and officials sign an annual acknowledgement that they understand the policy that has been passed and they agree to abide by it, and then require an annual written disclosure of all significant outside activities, financial interests, or relationships that may present a conflict or the appearance of one. And the rest of the written material that I have provided for you, I've just given you some resources. The first one here is your Code of Ethics, which I notice is also framed up on the wall. The point I wanted to make is that Principles 5 and 6 go directly to the issue of conflicts of interest. So obviously this is something that you all care about and have considered. Next, Sedgwick County Charter Resolution number 68. I copied out for you clause 10.5, which is the conflict of interest clause. And this has to do with ensuring that there are no conflicts of interest that are not managed relating to purchasing or contracting procedures for the county. And then the rest of the slide decks deal with Kansas statutes. And what I've done is pulled out KSA 75 as it pertains to local governments. And so what this would do would be walk you through the state's definition of a substantial interest, of how much money individuals can earn from a company in a year before it has to be reported, and that type of information. And all of you, I'm sure, are familiar with this, as when you signed up to run for public office, you would have had to have filled out the statement of substantial interest, and these are the statutes that would have applied to that. So that was the end of my prepared comments for today, so I would be happy at this point, if anybody has any questions, to take those.